In the annals of human history, no army had ever journeyed so far. In the summer of 326 BC, as Alexander's soldiers stood by the banks of the Hyphasis River, they had marched 20,000 kilometers from Macedonia. And it was here, at the edge of the known world, that this invincible army for the first time uttered a single word to their king: no. In the winter of 3030 BC, when Alexander pursued Bessus, the last Persian monarch, into Bactria, his army experienced for the first time what it truly meant to be in an alien land. This was no longer the familiar Mediterranean world of the Greeks, nor the fertile plains of Persia. The Hindu Kush, known locally as the Hindu Killer, presents a natural barrier with peaks towering over 5,000 meters, standing formidably before any conqueror. In the thin air, each step becomes a grueling ordeal for the Macedonian hoplites. Soldiers begin to suffer from altitude sickness, experiencing vomiting, headaches, and difficulty breathing. But the real challenge was not nature, but people. The nomads of Bactria and Sogdiana had a completely different way of warfare. They did not line up in neat formations awaiting decisive battles like the Persian army. Instead, they moved like phantoms through the valleys, surrendering one day and rebelling the next. During the pursuit of Bessus, Alexander demonstrated remarkable adaptability. He abandoned the traditional tactics of Greek hoplites, formed light infantry units, and learned to fight in mountainous terrain. When Bessus was ultimately betrayed by his companions and delivered to Alexander, the usurper was executed in the traditional Persian manner by having his nose and ears cut off, followed by crucifixion in Babylon. In the spring of 327 BC, an event occurred at a mountaintop fortress in Sogdiana, known as the Sogdian Rock, that would alter Alexander's personal fate. The local noble Hydaspes refused to surrender, and his fortress, built atop sheer cliffs, was considered impregnable. Alexander gathered 300 volunteers, promising a reward of 12 talents of gold to the first person to reach the summit. Under the cover of night, these brave warriors scaled the nearly vertical cliff face using ropes and iron spikes. 30 of them fell to their deaths, but the rest emerged above the fortress at dawn. When the morning sun illuminated the Macedonian soldiers on the mountaintop, the fortress garrison thought Alexander's army had grown wings. Hydaspes chose to surrender. At the surrender ceremony, Alexander first laid eyes on Roxana, the daughter of a Sogdian noble, whom contemporary historians described as the most beautiful woman in Asia. Whether this marriage was a political calculation or true love, we may never know. What is certain, however, is that by marrying the daughter of a local noble, Alexander sent a clear message to the peoples of Central Asia. He was not merely a conqueror, but also willing to become one of them. This wedding caused a great controversy among the Macedonian officers. They followed Alexander to conquer the East, not to become Easterners themselves. A rift began to quietly widen within the conqueror's army. In the autumn of 328 BC, in Maracanda, present-day Samarkand, a banquet turned into a tragedy. It was a cold night, with Alexander and his generals gathered in a warm tent, drinking cup after cup of wine. Cleitus, the veteran who had once saved Alexander's life at the Battle of the Granicus, began to voice his complaints loudly. He accused Alexander of forgetting Macedonian traditions and turning into an Eastern despot. He mocked those who performed the Persian act of prostration before Alexander, declaring that true Macedonians would never kneel to anyone. Alcohol ignited the long-suppressed rage. Alexander leaped to his feet, seized a spear from a nearby guard, and thrust it through Cleitus's chest. Blood splattered across the ornate Persian carpet, plunging the tent into a deathly silence. After sobering up, Alexander was plunged into profound remorse. He shut himself in his tent for 3 days and nights, refusing to eat. The man who had conquered half of the known world found himself unable to conquer his own temper. It is said that he wept, lamenting that he was worse than the mad Achilles, for Achilles at least had not killed a friend who had once saved his life. In the spring of 326 BC, Alexander's army stood at the banks of the Indus River. For the Greeks, this river marked the edge of the civilized world. Beyond it lay a legendary land, said to be home to talking trees, ants larger than houses, and sages who could live for 1,000 years. But what awaited them was not a myth, but a real and formidable enemy. King Porus ruled over the Punjab region, standing over 2 meters tall and commanding an army that included 200 war elephants. These colossal beasts were the ultimate war machines of the time, each resembling a moving fortress. The Battle of the Hydaspes River took place during the rainy season. Torrential rains caused the river to swell, and the muddy conditions made marching difficult. Alexander employed his signature tactic of deception. For several consecutive nights, he had his troops create the illusion of crossing the river along the banks, exhausting Porus's army with constant alerts. The actual crossing took place on a stormy, pitch-dark night. Alexander personally led his elite troops in a secret crossing several kilometers upstream. By the time Porus discovered this, the Macedonian army had already established a position on his flank. Facing the charge of war elephants, the Macedonian phalanx appeared vulnerable for the first time. The colossal beasts trampled soldiers and tossed bodies into the air with their trunks. But Alexander was well prepared. He ordered his archers to concentrate their fire on the mahouts and instructed spearmen to wound the elephant's eyes and trunks. The wounded and enraged elephant began trampling everything in its path, friend or foe, turning the battlefield into a hellscape. Though Porus fought valiantly, he was ultimately captured. When Alexander asked him how he wished to be treated, the Indian king proudly replied, "As a king." This response earned Alexander's respect, leading him not only to release Porus but also to expand his kingdom. Shortly after the Battle of the Hydaspes, Alexander lost his most loyal friend. Bucephalus, the warhorse that had accompanied him for 10 years, died of old age and battle wounds. This horse had witnessed every victory from the Granicus to India. Alexander held a grand funeral for Bucephalus and founded a city at the place where it died, naming it Bucephala. It is unique in history for a conqueror to build a city for a horse. This city still exists in Pakistan today, although its name has changed. The death of Bucephalus seemed to signal an end of sorts. The army was too weary, having journeyed too far. The soldiers began to yearn for the vineyards and olive groves of their homeland, for the wives and children they hadn't seen in years. In July 36 BC, by the banks of the Hyphasis River, the most successful conquest in history came to an end. 2 consecutive months of monsoon rains had caused everything to rot. Leather grew moldy, metal rusted, and the soldiers' morale hit rock bottom. Alexander gathered his army and delivered a passionate speech. He told them that beyond the Ganges lay the end of the world, and with just a little more effort, they would accomplish the greatest feat in human history. But this time, no cheers were heard. The silence lingered for a long time until finally the veteran Cleitus stepped forward. With a trembling voice, the general who had followed Alexander for 8 years voiced the collective sentiment of all. They had marched 20,000 kilometers, traversed deserts, scaled snow-capped mountains, and crossed countless rivers. They had conquered the Persian Empire and reached the edge of the known world. Now it was time to go home. Alexander returned to his tent in anger and shut himself away for 3 days like a child. He hoped the soldiers would change their minds and follow him as they had before, but this time there was only silence in the camp. On the third day, Alexander finally emerged from his tent. He ordered a sacrifice to inquire whether the gods favored continuing the advance. When the priests reported unfavorable omens, he at last found a dignified excuse to halt. By the end of July 36 BC, this once unstoppable army began its long journey home. On the banks of the Hyphasis River, Alexander ordered the construction of 12 massive altars dedicated to the 12 Olympian gods. These altars marked the farthest reach of Greek civilization. It is said that each altar stood 50 cubits high, resembling temples of giants. The return journey was no easier than the outward one. While sailing down the Indus River, Alexander encountered fierce resistance from the Malians. During a siege, he was the first to scale the city wall, only to be struck by an arrow that pierced his lung, nearly killing him. When his soldiers finally breached the city, they slaughtered every Malian, including women and children. Fear can sometimes be more effective than mercy. In 325 BC, when the army reached the mouth of the Indus River, many Macedonian soldiers witnessed the ocean tides for the first time. They believed it was the river god expressing anger. Alexander, however, ordered the construction of a fleet, planning to explore the Arabian Sea. Even in retreat, his desire for conquest never waned. However, the most daunting trial still lay ahead. The march through the Gedrosian desert turned into a disaster. During the 60-day trek across the desert, Alexander lost more soldiers than in all his battles combined. Lack of water, scorching heat, and sandstorms transformed the conqueror's army into a desperate band of survivors. When a soldier found a small amount of water and offered it to Alexander, he poured it onto the sand, saying that if his soldiers couldn't drink, neither would he. This story may be a later embellishment, but it reflects a truth. At the edge of the world, Alexander learned to be a better leader, not through conquest, but by sharing in hardship. In 324 BC, when Alexander finally returned to Babylon, he was no longer the young king who had left Macedonia 8 years earlier. He had witnessed the vastness of the world and experienced the limits of empire. In human history, no individual had ever changed such a large part of the world in such a short time. Yet the rebellion by the banks of the Hyphasis River tells us an eternal truth. Even the greatest conqueror cannot subdue the longing for home in the human heart. An empire may expand without limits, but human patience has its bounds. At the edge of the world, Alexander encountered a boundary he could not cross, not geographical, but human. This is the paradox of conquest. The farther you go, the farther you are from the beginning. The more you gain, the easier it is to lose everything. Just 1 year later, he would die mysteriously in Babylon, leaving behind an empire too large to sustain. But that is another story.